Okay, looks like we're live and maybe the sound is still okay.
Yes.
All right, sounds good. Yay! Sometimes, you just gotta stop and try again. Um, welcome everybody. Our guest today is Jeffe Kennedy, who is an author of who I met through SIFWA, actually. And you have a very big series that you're working on. What's the name of the series, Jeffe?
Well, it kind of depends on how you slice it, but it started as the 12 Kingdoms, and then once I completed the original trilogy, we branched out, and now the next sequence is called the Uncharted Realms, because I kept finding more kingdoms.
Okay, yeah, sounds good. And what genre does this fall into?
It's fantasy. It's fantasy or fantasy romance, depending on how you do the subgenres, but it's basically an epic fantasy arc, but then each story has a love story in it as well.
Okay. Now, when you're working with this series, do you find that you're having to conform to a particular set of guidelines about how romance should be handled?
Well, not really. I mean, I'm a romance author also. I write contemporary romance and erotic romance, and I'm a member of Romance Writers of America also. So, like all genres, romance has a very specific contract with the reader. So
Okay.
that I kind of follow, but it's not like my editor or publisher gives me any kind of guideline.
I see. That's interesting. So how do you conceptualize this contract with the reader?
Really, there's only one rule in romance, but it's sort of the one rule to rule them all, and that is that there must be a happy ever after. You can do pretty much anything to your characters within that. There are things that you have to do if you're gonna, cross certain lines. You have to redeem it in certain ways. But that's the main thing: is that there has to be either a happy for now or a happy ever after.
Cool. So when you were starting to write this particular book called Pages of the Mind, um, what was the genesis of this particular book?
Well, the original trilogy was about my three princesses. I kind of wanted to go off of the fairy tales. So it was the three daughters of the High King, each more beautiful than the last. And, little feedback there. And so each of those stories told their journey.
Mm-hmm.
And I originally sold it as like a 3-book deal. And in the course of those stories, there was the gal who sort of serves as the kingmaker. She's the librarian, and she ends up assisting all three heroines in their journeys. And so when that series did well, and I kept getting all these emails from readers saying, when is Daphne going to get her own story? It was like, it hadn't occurred to me that my librarian kingmaker would get her own story. But when we decided to do more books, it was very obvious who the next one would be.
Okay, so that makes sense because as I enter this book, I can feel the weight of a great deal of story that has preceded it. At the same time, though, it does stand on its own, and it's a really fun story to stand on its own. So from here, let's dig into the world a little bit. What was your original concept for this world, and has it expanded as you've written the different books?
It's absolutely expanded, thus Uncharted Realms from the original 12 Kingdoms. I didn't have an original concept for the world because I'm a very character-driven writer. So I start with a character and then discover the world as I ride around in my characters' heads. So other than it having kind of this sense of the fairy tale feel, I didn't really have a particular idea about the world. I had that idea of the three princesses, and then I also had a dream that was sort of the genesis of the first book, which was called The Mark of the Tala. And I'd originally shopped it as the middle princess because I wanted to tell the story of the middle princess, like all the fairy tales tell the eldest and the youngest, and I wanted to find out what happened to the middle.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'd had this dream about being trapped in a castle with a monster outside, and my sister kept promising to protect me, and they kept sending people out to slay the monster, and everybody was dying. And I knew I had to go out and face the monster myself, or everybody would die for me. And so that's kind of the pivot of the Mark of the Tala. So you can see how that kind of has a fairy tale feel to it already.
Yeah. Cool.
So that was where the world came from, is that I knew that it had kind of magic and monsters and kind of a non-tech world.
Yeah. And was there a point as you were writing where you had to sort of make the world crystallize and do something new?
Oh, sure. I mean, absolutely, as it goes. My middle princess starts out, sort of raised in the high castle, where she's been very protected. And as she moves out of it, she discovers more and more about her world. And eventually goes into this land that's sort of almost been mythological, that's supposed to be populated by shapeshifters and wizards and demons. And so I didn't know what that land was going to be like until she got there. So
yeah. Well, I like talking to you about this way because, in fact, we have a lot of people on the show who come in with, big plans for their world building and stuff, right? And then there are other people who come in who are like, but I don't world build. And it turns out, well, of course they world build, but they just do it in a different way. So it's nice to engage with this process, this world building process, as something that happens while you write, and not just something that has to somehow, you don't need a world building Bible to be a world builder, right?
It seems like a lot of people might as well.
And it's difficult for me to figure out anything ahead of time. I don't pre-plot. I don't world build ahead of time because I write for discovery. And so that's just, it'd be nice if I did it a different way because it might be more efficient. But that's kind of how it comes to me, is through the process of writing.
Yeah, and in fact, yeah, most people I think have written for discovery at one time or another. But sometimes it works better for them and sometimes it doesn't. Yeah. I did it once and then I was like, gee, that was really uncoordinated. Let's try planning ahead.
Yeah.
But
and so then the other piece for me that I should probably bring into it is that I'm trained as a scientist. That's what I did, like my graduate work in, and a lot of my career. I worked for an environmental consulting firm for a really long time. So my world tends to be very informed by ecology and biology. And so that's just kind of like a natural framework for me that fills in as I go, like what is the landscape like, what are the plants and animals there.
Good background to have.
Cool. So was there a point when you sat down between the drafts and said, "Oh, I need to know," like for example, so Uncharted Realms, and we're going out into a part of this world that we haven't seen before. Was there a point when you said, "I have to figure out what's out there because and how the events of this trilogy have affected it," or did you just go, well, let's just see how this. Do you know what I mean?
Well, basically what happened is through the course of the original trilogy, in the third book, the third book is the story of the eldest princess, who is the heir to the throne and a warrior. And I knew, and this is partly maybe comes from the romance framework too, I knew that she would have to be confronted with a man that she could not deal with. That would be totally different for her. And I wanted him to be a foreign mercenary. So he naturally came from some place that was totally outside of the 12 kingdoms. And so by introducing him, I opened up the door to this whole greater part of the world that was outside of their realm. And so by the end of that book, it had introduced a lot of political complications, that there was this empire that he was from. And so that's what happens in the Pages of the Mind, and why we ended up calling it the Uncharted Realms, is because of those political complications, my librarian is sent out as a spy, essentially, to go uncover what could be a potential threat to the empire or to
Right.
the 13 kingdoms.
Okay. So once you start getting into this is I'm going to ask you some questions that are going to be less process questions, since most of this is character-driven discovery. But so about the character-driven discovery point, I am totally down with that, because one of the things that, even though I do a ton of planning, my main philosophy is that the character is the ambassador to the world, right? Yeah, and so whether you've planned it or not, the character's still the ambassador to the world. But so in this particular book, you actually have some interesting things going on, because you've got a character who goes to a place that she doesn't expect to go, and ends up finding people whose language she does not speak, nor does anyone else in the group speak it, really.
Right.
And so what you have is you have the plot trying to go along, while at the same time they're trying to learn each other's languages, which is always very challenging, and I thought you handled it quite well. So could you tell us a bit about what that was like for you, trying to write this scenario where people weren't speaking each other's languages?
It was awful. So again, this kind of comes from this Genesis idea of the romance, that I wanted my librarian heroine, who is very smart and very bookish and speaks several languages and is really, really good with words. I wanted her to be confronted with a hero that she could not communicate with.
Mm-hmm.
And so, so that was where I knew that he would speak a language that would be completely unrelated to her other languages. And I'm fascinated by language anyway. I speak a couple of different of the Romance languages, and I understand a little bit of Chinese, and I'm very interested in the way, and a little bit of Gaelic. And so I'm very interested in the way that the different branches of languages operate differently, and the way a pitched language operates differently than other kinds, or a pictographic alphabet as opposed to a phonetic alphabet, and all of this kind of thing. So that was what I did, was I took it out to like a totally different structured language, and then I started writing it. And when I get to the part after her her companions leave and isolate her there, and she doesn't speak this language, and and so there's a big chunk of the book where there's a lot of gesturing.
Oh boy.
A lot of gesturing and a lot of pointing, and I'm like, this book is just going to fail. It's going to be awful. People are going to read it and say, well, it was okay, except that half the book was people pointing, grunting, and gesturing. And so I was complaining to my crit partners as I was writing it. I was like, why did I think this was a good idea? Why did I do this? And they're like, you like to challenge yourself. Just keep going. Just keep going. So, but it was pain. It was not easy to write. And
yeah. So did you have a very? I mean, so it sounds like you have some background in languages and possibly linguistics. Do you?
Not so much. I'm just a word person. I mean, because I'm a writer, I guess. And I, had took various. I studied French in high school, and then, and once you, and then I'm really interested in etymology. I guess that's another piece of it. So once you learn another language, it's really interesting, because you go back to the Latin roots, and you begin to understand how you can rapidly learn other Romance languages, because they all come off of basically the same roots.
Right.
And I find that very interesting. And then those languages that are totally different than that are fascinating too. And I did my graduate work in neurobiology, so I'm really interested in how the brain is formed by language. Like a Chinese speaker's brain is connected very differently than a Romance speaker's brain.
We're gonna have a conversation later. I can just tell, because I have some people whose work you might be really interested in, but that's probably not relevant to the current hangout. So, Yeah, very cool. All right, so was there a particular type of language that you wanted to model this language after, the foreign language that's spoken by the hero?
Well, yes. I mean, I go to my etymology dictionaries and build words off of real languages because I'm not Tolkien and I'm not going to create a whole language from scratch. I'm not that smart. Uh, so yes, I used Hawaiian and Polynesian roots for Nakoa's language, for the Nahanan language.
Interesting.
But then I bastardized it. I took the words and then warped them.
Was that driven by the kind of culture you wanted to portray, or?
Yes, because it's a tropical island, and so I wanted that feel. I wanted to convey that feel.
Mm-hmm.
And then also I knew that it would be a pitched language. It would be a comparatively pitched language and different enough from, because I necessarily write in English, I knew that the stories I've written so far, and so her world would already be kind of like a romance language structured world. So I wanted something that would feel very different than that. And I like Polynesian culture and language, so, and theology.
I thought that actually, I think it's very interesting because if you're working on the basis of a particular language, you have to be careful to alter it enough that it's not
exact. Yeah.
Because I mean, I thought you did a good job of fleshing out the culture of these islands so that it was not some kind of appropriated version of Hawaiian culture, for example.
Exactly. I wanted to make sure not to do that.
Because I mean, and there are risks there, and I thought you avoided them rather deftly.
Oh, good. Thank you.
Yeah. So it was cool, but it seemed pretty clear, for example, that the significance of volcanoes was there, but it was different. It meant something different to these people than it would have meant to the people of Hawaii or other Polynesian islands. And,
right.
I mean, so I think whether or not you did it on the fly, I think there was a lot of thought and some interesting stuff going on there in terms of making sure to reorient some of the cultural information so that it wasn't directly referential to real-world peoples.
Yeah. I wanted to make sure to do that, so I'm glad that worked. One of the few words that I did use directly, which I thought was so cool I couldn't resist, is the word mo'o. The M-O''O for dragon is actually the Polynesian word for dragon. And I thought that was super cool that they had a word for dragon.
Yeah. Which language is that from?
It was. I think it was just Polynesian. I don't remember if there was like a particular dialect or island origin. I found it in an obscure place. It wasn't in the usual dictionary, so.
That's interesting. Okay. Let's see.
So Sarah's asking a question.
Oh yeah. Sure.
On tips for how to research cultures for this purpose. I don't know if I'm good at answering that because I don't do a lot of research. Part of it's because I only became a writer later in life, and before that I was pretty much an exhaustive reader, and I had a lot of education, and so I've read so much and studied so much that a lot of it's already in my head. But I guess the way I usually get at it is like from the the behind the name websites or the dictionary sites, and I like going through those and then a lot of times I'll just do searches for people put together great stuff. I mean, what did we do before the internet?
Well, I have to say the internet is such an incredible resource, and you can find all kinds of things like Sarah, for example, we had my brain is not working. Malin Edwards on here. talking about his story called The Half-Dark Promise. And he actually found a very specific website to help him with Haitian Creole.
Oh, wow.
Which he used in that story, and I highly recommend the story, and I would urge you to take a look at both you can go back to our Hangout video if you're interested, or the Hangout report if you want to read up on it. And I do have the link to that website there, but there are a lot of little hidden websites out there, and what you're looking for is people who have some direct source knowledge. So, for example, this particular website on Haitian Creole is run by a person who speaks Haitian Creole.
Yeah, primary sources are always the most undiluted, so.
Right.
And that was like one of the websites I found was just like colloquial Hawaiian phrases.
Mm-hmm.
And, and I liked those because they weren't in the dictionary so much, but they were common use words. And so I felt freer to kind of adopt them and use them for my purposes.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to go back to a slightly different issue. A couple of times already in our discussion so far, you've spoken about the importance of the heroine meeting a man she can't handle. And I think, in fact, that's in my not so extensive reading of romance books. I have encountered that every single time. There's always something about how the heroine must encounter a man she can't handle, and how she can't handle him depends a great deal on circumstances. But in each of those cases, one of the things that was going on was this, sort of instant physical attraction, which I know happens. And at the same time, I know it doesn't happen every time. So I kind of wonder, how do you think about the process of creating heroes and heroines that are complementary and interesting and will have interesting arcs in their relationships, I guess?
Well, so part of the point of romance, the great criticism leveled at romance is that you know how it will end. Kind of absurd because all genres have a promise for how they'll end. Mysteries promise that you'll find out who done it. Thrillers promise that that the bad guy will be caught and punished.
Also,
so the point of romance is the arc. It's the journey, and it's that the hero or heroine, or hero and heroine, depending on because there's a lot of same-sex too, or polyamorous. But the promise is that you're moving a person from a place where they're unfulfilled and unsatisfied to where they're like a whole enough person in order to find love and be happy, find someone that they can partner with in life. So it goes from a place where they are not a whole person, where there is some sort of wound or flaw that is keeping them back, and that by meeting this other person, that they will have to transform, that they will have to change in some profound way in order to seize happiness, to seize happiness as embodied by love. That's the romance promise. And of course you don't have to have love to be happy, but that's what romance does.
Right.
So when I talk about, like finding a hero that she can't handle, it's otherwise the heroine would continue along her same trajectory. She has no incentive to have to change. So this is where the inherent conflict in the romance arc comes from, is this, here is this person and there has to be some attraction. It doesn't have to be instant physical attraction for sure. And a lot of times it's better if there's not instant physical attraction. But, it may be not revulsion, but the other person doesn't have to be compelling. But there has to be an attraction, a reason why the heroine, these books are told from the heroine's point of view, so we'll stick with that for now. There has to be a reason for her to want to change in order to be with the guy. But then also a very strong reason for why it's very difficult for her to do so. One of the things that I really am proud of is that on this book and the next one, the one that comes out at the end of December, my editor told me both times that he didn't see any way for the hero and heroine to possibly have a happy ever after until the last 20 pages.
Oh, that's impressive.
And I think that's really important, because if it's too easy, then the romance arc is unsatisfying. You know, if it's like, well, of course, all they have to do is, you know, just say, oh, I love you, and they're together. I mean, it's like, well, okay, but that it's better if they have to make a profound change, and preferably some kind of great sacrifice in order to seize that happiness.
Yeah. So, do you conceptualize this as something that should be done by the hero and by the heroine, or just by one?
It depends on the story. Because these stories are fantasies, there's a lot more plot going on than just the romance arc. There's a lot of political problems too. So if it's a straight romance, like a contemporary romance, you can have both the hero and the heroine needing to come together, and a lot of the stories about them fighting to make that trajectory. If you do that in a story that has a lot of other stuff going on too, you could get really mired. There's just too much going on. So usually, at least in these books and this series, the heroes have had less change to make than the heroines do, mainly because these books are about the heroines. It's about the women making their journeys to both find happiness and self-fulfillment, but also to accomplish things in the greater world, to overcome the external conflict of loyalty and fighting to save the things that are important to them.
Okay, cool. Well, all right, here we go. Because I have to ask you this.
Okay.
I think that you did some things to explore how the rules and taboos surrounding sexual behavior differ between the different cultures that you're working with. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, and actually when I teach some classes, particularly on writing sex scenes online, and one of them is all about taboos.
That sounds fascinating.
And so I'm very interested in taboos in general. And some of that ties into Polynesian culture. The word taboo actually comes from Polynesian culture. And they have this idea that in order for a person to grow spiritually, to become self-fulfilled, in a sense to become fully adult, they have this idea that we all start out as children, and we receive these sort of cultural taboos that are meant to help us survive to adulthood, right? Like don't put your hand on a hot stove, don't eat your dessert before dinner, all of these kinds of things. And that as we become adults, you have to break those childhood taboos, or you stay forever a child internally. You never grow into an adult person. So taboos are a big piece of that, because we also have a lot of cultural taboos. A lot of that's meant to make us be able to live together peacefully, right? Like you can't murder people, you shouldn't speed. There's sort of like all of this escalating scales of what's allowed and what isn't.
Right.
Well, with sexuality, breaking taboos is a way that you can do this in a safe environment. There are a lot of taboos that come from our childhood that are related to sex. Keep your clothes on. All of the rules for what you can't be alone with a boy, or you can't be alone with another girl, or you can't sleep with another person. All these things. So. And taboos tend to be, as you say, very culturally based, right? what's okay in the U.S. is not okay in China, and Polynesian culture is different. So yeah, I like that getting at character transformation by making my characters profoundly uncomfortable. One way to do that is by testing their sexual taboos.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't know if that answered your question.
No, it's a good start. Can you give us some, like, so for the people who are here who haven't read the book, can you give us some specific examples of differences between the culture that Daphne comes from and the culture that, yeah.
I'm trying to think of how to do that easily. She comes from, it's kind of a European-ish Renaissance type, medieval type fairy tale culture. I mean, it's not our world, but she's a person who, she was orphaned when the High King took over her family's castle. She was the only one who survived out of everyone. He razed the castle and built the Castle Ordnung, the seat of the kingdom of the 12 kingdoms, on the bones of her family's castle. And she's been essentially a political hostage her entire life. And she's managed through her intelligence and guile to kind of disappear herself and take over the library. But the High King had plans to marry her off for political reasons. And when that didn't work out, he kind of forgot about her. But it served her purposes to keep herself closeted, and she's a virgin. I mean, she's, in her late 30s, and she's, only ever like kissed a couple guys, and she didn't even like it. So, and she worries at points in the book that she's asexual. One of her traveling companions is a warrior woman who is just exuberantly sexual. Jeffe is really kind of pansexual, and Jeffe totally does not get how Daphne could be this way. It's like completely alien to her way of thinking.
Mm-hmm.
So when Daphne gets to the islands and is, sort of accidentally married to the king because she doesn't realize, she's trying to be diplomatic and go along with this ritual, then she is really faced with this cultural conflict where he is a very sexual person and intent on being sexual with her, and she has absolutely no idea how to handle it. I don't know, does that define it?
Yeah, that starts to get at it.
It's nice to see in any work a spectrum of not just of you're asexual, you're not, but of people just have different levels, I guess, and I just admire that. I don't know.
Good,
yeah, different levels of interest in sexual behavior and that kind of thing.
Yes, definitely.
Mm-hmm. I'm taking notes.
Well, that's good. That's nice to know.
Well, what I do is I always write this up at the end, and so I'm a little bit behind on my write-ups right now, but I will try to have this write-up up by next week. And it's for people who don't have an hour to watch a whole video, but still want to know what we talked about. So
that's great. Yeah.
Easier to come back.
Yeah, exactly. It makes a nice reference without having to watch the entire archive. And oh my gosh,
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see. I wanted to ask one more thing, and that is about the shapeshifters. It's a little tangential, I guess, but it's there in the book, and it seems like you had a good deal of fun with the distinctions between the two different groups of people. There's something interesting going on there. Can you tell us about how, shapeshifting is such a common idea, And yet, in order to actualize it in a book like this, you have to have your own concept of how it should work and what its significance is. And I want to have you maybe explain a little bit about how that concept works in your book and the kinds of expression that you gave to it in your world.
Okay, well, some of it gets established in that first book when I mentioned the Mark of the Tala. When the princess ends up going to this realm of the shapeshifters, wizards, and demons, and that's the land of the Tala. And somebody who wrote a review of the book said, oh, and the Tala are obviously an analog for the fairies. Mm-hmm. And I thought, well, I wouldn't say it was obvious, but I can see it. I'm really interested in the idea of mutability. Mm-hmm. It kind of, when we talk about that everybody has that theme, that comes out of, that's their voice and they have the theme that they're always writing around. My whole theme is transformation. It's, mutability, transformation. I'm always writing about that in one way or another. And so the Tala, I didn't want them to be, like a were creature necessarily. Mm-hmm. They're based on the old Celtic idea of the shapeshifter. A being who can take any form at all. And so the Tala, there's a range among those people, a whole scale of, some of them can't shapeshift at all. Some can shift into only one form, and only when the magic conditions are right. Mm-hmm. Others, and it's sort of related to pureness of blood that goes back to the goddesses. And then some can take any form at all. So another one of Daphne's companions is Zinda, and Zinda is a descendant of one of the most powerful Tala sorceress queens, and Zinda can take a lot of animal forms. Mm-hmm. And so it changes her nature. I guess that's part of, like my thing about language shapes how people see the world. I think that being a shapeshifter informs how she sees the world too. That. Mm-hmm. The different animal forms she takes influence how she views things and her sympathies with the world. Like she's, it's in the next book, but I don't think it's spoilery. There becomes a point where she, actually I think it happens in Pages of the Mind too, but she draws lines where she refuses to use her magical abilities to simply kill animals that are posing a danger to them, unless they're posing a direct danger. She won't do something that would like wipe out a whole species of animal or a whole group or some individuals. It's only if it's in self-defense. And part of that comes from her being living in animal forms too. That she sees them as equally valid life forms and not just to be. And it causes problems here and there.
Well, I could actually see. I can see your biology and ecology coming through in that, in fact. And
yes.
And there's this great scene, you guys, in the book when the boat gets attacked by like a giant purple squid.
As one does.
Like you do, you run into the giant squid. Yeah. But what I wanted to say is that the way they get out of the situation is very clever. And very science-based. And, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And I don't know if I want to say, because I want you guys to go read this book. But it's fun, I think, because often people will try to, I don't know, I think that the stereotypical way of thinking about fantasy is that fantasy somehow doesn't have anything to do with science.
Right.
Right. And in fact, in so many books that I read, science is actually just sort of co-occupying the space with magic. It's just that there's different kinds of stuff going on. And that was one of the things that I think was really interesting about this particular book, because it's clear that science exists in the world, and because of Daphne's character, is valued in this book too. So there's this very interesting simultaneous sense of, yes, there is science in this world. Oh, and by the way, there's magic. And Daphne struggles a little bit to kind of reconcile those two things. But I think that in itself is an interesting way in which she represents the world.
Yeah, and Daphne was a fun heroine to have for me that way, just because she has so much knowledge that and she likes to put the puzzle pieces together. So she's forced to accept, and magic is, and that's something we should probably explain to the others, is fairly new to a lot of the outer realm, because it's released from the land where the Tala live. But that's only recently happened. It happens in the first, well, it kind of happens in the first trilogy.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah, it really happened. In the original trilogy, magic is confined to Onophan, where the Tala live, and at the very end of Talon of the Hawk, the third book, it's released. And so, and it's acting as, in my mind, magic almost acts like a form of radiation. It's kind of, again, I guess going back to mutability, it causes mutations in the world. And so there's the nature that's familiar to us through our physical laws and biological laws, but then magic sort of brings in this other layer and kind of warps it and moves it around. So both things, you're right, both things are equally true. And it's not always easy to sort out how the one affects the other.
Yeah. Cool. All right. Well, so here we are at 4 minutes to 11. So I'm going to say, do you guys have questions that you'd like to ask Jeffe before we go?
I just have some generalized stuff. I'm not sure if it would be appropriate for this particular hangout.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, as someone who is, relatively young and relatively uneducated, I'm never sure how to go about learning about different cultures in general, because I'll look at the primary sources and I'll be like, I have no idea what's significant here. I don't know how to read this in such a way as to extract things about the culture. And I'm like, where do I go to get a grounding in something so that I know what to look for, kind of? I was just wondering if you more experienced folks have any tips about that.
I'm not sure I have any good advice except to read widely. I mean, that's...
Well,
yeah, always good advice.
So you can read widely, and you can read history, which I think is really, really valuable. But the other thing that you can do is, if you're looking for an organization scheme that will allow you to grapple with questions of culture and language and stuff like that, you might want to look into anthropology.
Oh, definitely. My mom has her bachelor's in that. She's always like, go take anthropology classes.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Go take anthropology classes, because what they will do is they will give you the language and the organization system that will help you to sort of orient yourself in a world full of information.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's good. Yeah, I've taken
anything, Jay?
Steal the bits that you like and then change it. That's probably terrible advice. But I'm always looking for little bits, little nuggets, interesting little bits that I can steal and put in things.
Yeah. It also, I found... Go ahead.
Oh, and I mean, you're not supposed to do that nowadays. But, oh God, there's such good stuff out there I want to steal so badly.
Well, so I'll give you an example of something that I thought was such an amazing world-building piece. And they're all around us in the world. I learned the other day that in Canada, they sell milk in bags.
Huh.
Oh, yeah, I saw that.
And I was like, oh my gosh, that is such a cool world-building thing. And then somebody wrote to me and was like, only you could think of this as a world-building thing. You're not wrong, but only you could pick up on this as a world-building thing. But so, in a way, having a large schema to put your information in is really great, but it's also good to zero in on these really tiny little lifestyle details, right?
Right.
and and think about the whole system and how it fits together. So like in Jeffe's islands, you really get a sense of how the climate works and how the climate influences people's behavior and how it influences what they eat and where they live and how they live. And it's really, really interesting, Jeffe. You did a really good job, even if you did it on the fly. So you know what I'm saying?
Well, and it influences their language too, because their inflections are shaded by storm and weather analogies, because the weather has such a profound influence on their lives.
Right.
So
and so
instead of referring to something as being difficult, they refer to it as being stormy, or
right. And you can't extricate language from culture, and you can't extricate culture from location and from resources. Everything's connected. And so in a way,
which is one thing that makes it so intimidating to
well,
start.
but you know what? On the other hand, if you wanted to go into a really large garden, you'd have to enter somewhere, right?
Yeah.
And then you walk along the path, and then you kind of see other paths, and then you kind of decide how you want to approach it. If you want to, if your goal is to see how big the garden is from end to end, then you're going to try to keep your path pretty restricted. But if you want to see how many different kinds of flowers are in the garden, you take a different path, right? So it depends on what you're planning to do with it.
There was, I'm going to put this in the chat bar, but Pat Rambo gives a great little 2-hour class called From Idea to Draft. And a lot of like what she had us do was come with an idea and then sort of help us find an entry point to it. And that was great because it was like, she had us do a couple of writing exercises, and it was think about the details, think about the weather, something transitory about the season, think of like concrete details about, smells, sounds, textures. And it sort of made me, it sort of makes you realize what you're missing in that world too and what you need to work on. And I realized a lot of what I was missing from my idea was like, oh, I need to really think about this stuff. And then do some exploratory writings.
I think we're at the end. Jeffe, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
It was just a real pleasure. You're welcome back anytime. And if you have a new book that you want to come and talk about, please feel free to ping me and say, hey, can I come talk about my new book with you? And I'll be like, okay.
I'm going to have to look into this one.
So next week, I think I'm not going to be here. So I'm going to have to figure out how to reschedule next week. So what I'll do is I will tell you all to visit my Patreon. Go visit my Patreon and because you can be a part of a workshop there if you're interested in world building topics, and if you have the ability to sponsor me, great. Otherwise, you can just enjoy the show. But wanted you to let you know that's out there. And I'm going to stop the broadcast and stick around, Jeffe, because we're going to have a little after party here.
Oh, okay.
All right. Thank you so much.